Hey folks, this is Omi Sade Bernie Scott of the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. You know, back in April, I turned 53, and to turn 53 in the middle of a global pandemic, in the middle of a beautiful political uprising, it gives you a lot of things to think about. I've been thinking a lot about my mortality, about my relationships, thinking about my value, how life will be post-COVID, thinking about new normals and transformation, and kind of excavating messages that I received when I was a younger woman, even as far back to when I was a girl, when I was 12, which is when my cycle first started, and when I also first began a journey of identifying myself and figuring out what it meant to be perceived as worthy or valuable in my community and in romantic relationships. So much pressure put on you by white supremacy and patriarchy and misogyny as your brain is formulating what it means for your personhood to be fully actualized. And I wondered, are other people's stories similar who didn't grow up in this country? People who perhaps grew up in the global South? And that led me to a beautiful conversation with my newly minted sister of the heart, Mona Eltahawy. Many people are familiar with Mona because of her journalistic prowess, her writing and her work as a feminist, or maybe because of her all-famous "fuck the patriarchy." However you know Mona, or if you're meeting Mona for the first time, I think you're going to enjoy this conversation where we take a trip down memory lane together and introduce the 12-year-old Omi to the 12-year-old Mona. This is Omi Sade Bernie Scott. Welcome to the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause, introducing Mona Eltahawy. Mona, thank you so much for being who you are, first and foremost, right? Like, I think that for folk who are going to be tuning into this conversation, I'm going to share in my little pre-recorded intro all of your shit. I just want to say that right now off top. Like, when people tune in to this conversation, they're going to get the obligatory radio voice, Omi, doing my intro of who the hell you are. So, but Mona, I wanted to talk to you because, and I said this to you a little bit ago, there are some people I feel compelled by their spirit, not by their works, not by their title, not by their resume or their vitae, or who people presume there to be. There's something sometimes in people that their spirit or their light is so intense and just, it is a compulsion to want to connect with them because you're like, I see you. Like, I see you. And so I was beyond thrilled. Like, I had a dream about things that I wanted to do and people who I wanted to talk to. And I went to my ancestors and I asked permission to ask to talk to you. I said, listen, there's this person that I really dig and I want to talk to them. And I want to talk to them because I think that they not only get where I'm coming from at a kind of macro social justice radical level, but they get it down in their soul, like down in the bottom of their heart, in their stomach, in their belly, like they get what the hell it is I'm trying to do. And so I sat with them and I was like, I gave several names of people. I said, can I talk to this person? They're like, oh yeah, you can talk to this person. Can you talk to this person? No, I don't think you should talk to this person. Not yet. This person, definitely not. Do not talk to this person. And so I said, fuck it. I'm just going to ask, can I talk to Mona Eltahawy? And they were like, absolutely yes. Like, in the tradition that I practice, in the spiritual tradition that I practice, you have tools available to you when you are interacting with your ancestors and with the Orisha, and they give you very specific responses. And the specific response I got to you, to connect with you, to spend time with you, was an emphatic yes. I'm honored. So I don't know what kind of party our ancestors are having in the ancestral realm around. We would like for these two people to get to these 1967 babies. We would like for them to have a but yes. And so we were talking about your haircut the power of this ritual in this moment, in this time, and the stripping away and the mourning and this collective grief, and also powerful birth and transformation we are bearing witness to and holding and participating in. And how's your heart now?
My heart is trying to hold the immensity of this moment. But before I get to my heart, I want to respond to you first. So my heart will come. I'm honored. It's such an honor and such a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking with you, Omishade, honestly, because I, in my own way too, when I put out a question into the world, I remember when I first started speaking about perimenopause and I mentioned it on social media, one of the first responses I got was, "You have to speak to Omishade."
Really? That's what's up.
And I think it was Heather. Heather who's
Heather Karina. Yes.
And we both just spoke to her over the weekend.
We did. And Heather and I have the same birthday.
That's incredible. Look at that.
Isn't it crazy? We're both Aries and you're a Leo. It's the fire tribe. We find each other. It's real.
When I put it out there and I was like, I'm thinking of menopause rituals and I'm thinking of ways that I can honor this process that I'm going through. And I'm looking for women of color specifically. I don't want to follow white women through this because they dominate so much, That's how I was connected to you.
How you connected to me.
I was sent to you. So I do consider this ascending, and I heard it and I honor it. And it's a privilege to be speaking with you now, Omishade. So thank you for having me.
So this is the interesting thing. There are so many people who were like, well, what are the resources that are out here for when you're going through menopause? And I could not find anything for us.
Right.
Not one thing. Couldn't find it. And I also did not want this to be a space where I was going to focus primarily on the health aspects, the hot flashes and the night sweats and the weight fluctuations. I wanted to focus on the narrative.
Yes.
Like, how are you experiencing this change, which is such a big ass change? It's not just the physical change. It's a change in the way you think. Mm-hmm. It's a change in the way you see the world. Mm-hmm. It's a change in your shape.
Yes.
And so that's why I wanted to do that. And I wanted to do it selfishly because I needed that, and I needed that as someone whose mother is no longer in this physical world.
Yeah.
Who I would want to sit down and have these conversations with. And I feel certain that she would be tickled, surprised, aghast at some of my questions. My mother used to say, "Ooh, your mouth. Ooh, your mouth." I'm like, yeah, I know, mommy. Yes. But you love me anyway. And she did love me anyway, with all the mouth that I have always walked with in this crazy ass world. But before we jump into questions, I do want to check in with you around this moment. I have 2 sons. I have a 28-year-old who lives in Brooklyn, and I have an 11-year-old who lives here in North Carolina. And it has always been a constant prayer of protection on my lips for my sons. Constant. And when I saw the video, and I didn't mean to watch the video of George Floyd lose his life. I didn't mean to watch it. I kind of accidentally, when you're absent-mindedly fiddling with your phone, I was absent-mindedly filling through IG and I found the video. And he called out for his mom. Mm-hmm. He said, "I want my mama." Mm-hmm. He was calling his mom. And I didn't realize that his mother was an ancestor. Mm-hmm. That has stuck with me so hard. Mm-hmm. And so I know that my heart has been really heavy and with worry for my own children and other people's children. And my heart has also been inspired beyond belief by these young people who are finding their voices in this moment. To see this light that was already inside of them just flame all the way on and don't know what to do. They're like, what is happening? It's like people are finding their voices in this moment. But I just want to check in with you.
Yeah. My heart is, like I was saying, holding an immense grief, because I think that the fact that this revolution, and I truly believe it's a revolution, the fact that this revolution is happening now is a reaction to both and a rising up against what happened to George Floyd and what has been happening historically for such a long time to Black communities across this country. And so in that sense, I am grieving for both, because I know that the pandemic has disproportionately affected Black communities in this country, and disproportionately affected communities have historically been marginalized, whether Black or Indigenous or of color or disabled or the elders, all of this. So my heart is holding an immense amount of grief right now for all of that. And at the same time, I also share your hope and inspiration, because as an Egyptian now, and this is not to compare narratives, because every revolution has its own narrative and every revolution must write its own narrative. But as an Egyptian American now, I'm connecting to this moment as someone whose country of birth had a revolution in 2011. And that revolution rose up for very similar reasons and was also catalyzed into being by very similar reasons: police brutality, police violence, a state monopoly over violence, and a state not just disinterest and marginalization of people, but a state that deliberately targeted marginalized people. This is deliberate violence. Poverty is violence. Racism is violence. All of this, So I connect to this moment on so many levels. And I also connect to this moment through my own wound, because during the year of the Egyptian revolution, I was hurt. My body was directly hurt through state-sanctioned violence when Egyptian riot police broke both my arms and sexually assaulted me, and I was detained. So there are so many entry points for me during this moment. But I also want to take this moment and say that I honor and I acknowledge the queer Black women who are leading this revolution. Because we have to remember that 3 queer Black women founded Black Lives Matter several years ago. And this is Pride right now. And we have to remember that Pride began 51 years ago as a rebellion, as an uprising, as a revolution by trans and queer Black women and women of color. So there are just so much that is happening right now that I feel the confluence of. So my heart is trying to hold all of this and is just basically standing here and saying, I honor all of this.
I appreciate this so much. I appreciate you saying this so much. The ability of folk to remind us the origin story of movement, the role that queer Black women have played, trans Black women, trans Latinx women have played in these movement spaces. Because the deliberateness you talk about, the violence, of part of the violence is also rendering you invisible, relentlessly rendering you invisible. Like, I'm going to muzzle you. I'm going to deny you. I'm going to act as if you've never existed. I'm going to do the work of dismantling your humanity so people will question your rightful place contemporarily and in the history books. And so for us to reclaim those stories, it feels like medicine. It feels like healing. It feels like a resistance. It feels like a revolutionary act to be like, and you will say that person's name and you will acknowledge them. And those names will not only live in my mouth and your mouth, but other people's mouths. It's like, it's why we call on those folk to make sure people know who we're talking about. I had the great fortune of being in movement space with Opal and Alicia and Patrice through the BOLD program, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, which has been such a profound space of healing and leadership development and political education for Black activists across the country. And so many of the people who I see out here in the streets, not only protesting on the front lines, but making sure that people have the accurate information of how to keep themselves safe as much as they can.
Yeah.
Given the very feral nature of violence. So you can be prepared. You can have all of your gear. You can have your checklist. You can have your protest buddy. You can have all those things with you. But the very feral nature of that violence that we're looking at, that will grab somebody up, you don't have complete control over. But I have so much respect for them and so much love for them. I appreciate this moment. This moment is very powerful. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it continues to evolve and also continuing to lean into what role I can play in this moment, like what makes sense, how I can be supportive, all those things. So
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Thank you for who you have been and who you continue to be. I purchased your new book, right?
Thank you.
So he was like, The 7 Necessary Sins. He was like, what is this? And I was like, it's a book from mommy. He's like, okay. He said, it looks interesting. I said, it is interesting. He was like, He's very curious about all things. And we've talked so much about gender and identity and sexuality and sexual expression and autonomy and agency. And he's learning a lot about my process of aging because I had him when I was 41. So he's been on this perimenopausal, menopausal journey with me. But I know I created some questions for you. So I want to jump into some of these questions. And I would really like for you to share with us what your journey has been like as you've gotten older in liberation work. And I asked you this, Mona, because I've been having conversations with folk who I consider OGs in movement work, resistance work, liberation work, and folk are right now trying to claim new space. What's your role? What does it mean to move out of the way for younger leadership to walk in solidarity with that leadership?
Yes. It's been a really interesting process on Mashade because I've been thinking a lot about it. And I think cutting my hair has also been a part of that because I see how I've been moving towards something. And it connects to what you were saying about shedding earlier as well. It's like these cycles of 7 to 9 years where I go through something and then I viscerally feel that it's time for a new cycle. So I know that I'm on the cusp of a new cycle now. And where I am now is very connected to perimenopause. In a way, I've also felt that it connects me to the pandemic. So when this pandemic began, I felt like I was much more fluent in the language of my perimenopause, to put it in a more poetic way, because for a long time I was kind of like floundering with this perimenopause. And then when the pandemic began, I realized that what was happening is that we are leaving behind something and we are moving towards something. And it's not obvious what we're moving towards right now, but it's like, this is the transition period. And that's why I cut my hair, because I felt like I am standing along this corridor that represents that movement from what we used to be, and we can never go back to that, and what we're moving towards, which is becoming clearer, but it's not fully clear yet what it is. And that's how I feel as a woman, a cis woman going through perimenopause right now. And when it comes to liberation work and what I hope has been my contribution to it began as a journalist, as a news reporter who used her skills to highlight and expose the human rights violations, specifically of the Egyptian regime, because I became a journalist in Egypt. I initially wanted to become a journalist because for me, journalism represented freedom. When I was a 16-year-old, a teenager in Saudi Arabia. I was born in Egypt. My family moved to the UK when I was 7, and then we moved to Saudi Arabia when I was 15. And I was traumatized, I say, into feminism when we moved there because it was just so difficult to be a young woman, to be a woman there. And I became a journalist in Egypt when I was 21. Those were the early years of my liberation work, in that I was confronting the Egyptian regime with feminism and with news reporting. And then I moved to the United States, and then it became liberation work by claiming the I. Because I moved to the US in 2000, so that's 20 years ago now. The year after I moved were the 9/11 attacks. And as a woman of Muslim descent and Egyptian descent and African descent, a year into it, I was like, oh my God.
How did I end up in this place? Yes.
So yeah, it's like I moved here. It's like, wow, okay, what do I do now? And then news reporting then became irrelevant for me. I wasn't interested in so-called objectivity anymore. Objectivity for me was dead. It was a pretense anyway. So that was when I began to claim the I as part of my liberation work, because I used that I to push back against what I call the rock and the hard place. The rock are the white supremacist, Islamophobic racists who are invested in taking my words and weaponizing them against Muslims. And they don't give a fuck about me as a Muslim woman. And the hard place is the so-called Muslim community that wants to silence me because they want to defend all Muslim men against the rock. And they're not interested in me either. So I say, fuck you to the rock, and I say, fuck you to the hard place. And I began to do that with my use of the I. And I became an opinion writer, and I became an essayist. So that was the period from 2000 to about 2000, I would say, 5, 6. So in 2005, I moved back to Cairo to take part in protests in Egypt that eventually became the revolution. So that was a new stage of my liberation work, where I directly became an activist against kind of the dictatorship of the Egyptian regime, not as a journalist now, but as a feminist activist. And then I moved back to the United States soon after Trump became president, because this is the head of the Hydra. The United States is the head of the fascist, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal Hydra to paraphrase Sister Bell Hooks, you know? So I moved here to fight, to continue my liberation work. And here is exactly where I should be right now, because here, as we've seen, because now the revolution is here, because when people see what the regime in the United States has been doing for decades to Black communities, and within those Black communities, Black women specifically, cis and trans and non-binary, and then you extrapolate that, it allows you to see what regimes across the world do. Because this is the most powerful country in the world, and it is the Hydra from which all of this spreads across the world.
That's right. It's the playbook. It's the blueprint. I think that folk often forget that this is the blueprint. And, you know, in modern history, we are most certainly the blueprint that folk look to. And we have had a hand in the authoritarian nonsense and oppression all over the world.
Yeah, in Egypt, 5 U.S. administrations, Democrat and Republican, propped up our dictator of 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that part of our political education is the unlearning, because we all get the coding, we all get the indoctrination as children. And then at some point, either in our young adulthood, or maybe for some people right now, they get to call into question everything that they've ever believed about this place, everything that they've ever been taught about this place. I do love how it is the wisdom, the mother wit, the intelligence, the strategy, the healing, the liberatory practices of women, trans women, non-binary folk who are always putting out the call and providing the space for folk to figure out, well, where are you going to fit in? What are you going to do? What do you need in this moment? What do you need in this moment? And so I appreciate that. I have found myself having a bit of a hard time not being out in the protests. I've had friends call me and say, Omi, where are you? I'm like, I'm at my house. They're like, are you going out? I'm like, no. They're like, okay, I'm just checking on you. And it's because of the roles that we have found ourselves in a consistent way in our communities. There's an expectation of how you can show up. And I didn't think that this time it made sense for me to play the same role for a lot of reasons. One, I'm immunocompromised. I've had some health issues over the last couple of years that make it clear to me that I have to pay attention to my body in a different way than I ever have before. My mortality became more real for me in the last year, where I had a health scare, and it never occurred to me that I would leave this place. Even though we know that we are all going to die, it's not until you have a moment where death is sitting beside you on the bed and it's like, so you could go with me right now, or you could stay. And I was like, I'd like to stay. I feel like I have more work to do. It's like, okay, if you stay, you have to change the way you do the things that you do. You have to have fidelity to what you say you're going to do to stay. And that's challenging, because you feel compelled to still do the things that you've known how to do all this time, but you can't do it the same way. So I've been trying to figure out my role right now and feel good about the role that I can offer, that feels like it's coming from a deep place inside my body, that will not only honor this moment and honor the commitments I've made to our liberation, but honor the fact that my body deserves to be present and alive. Like, I don't want to participate and then be in memoriam when we get to liberation. You know what I'm saying?
I hear you completely. I know, I mean, I don't know you beyond, our knowing each other on social media, but I'm sure that in real life you have taken part in countless protests. And I believe that each of us has a role to play. I believe that we all stand on a spectrum when it comes to change and liberation work, and that we are needed on every position on that spectrum. And we do not have to duplicate or replicate the work of other people, because we need all of these roles. And I'm thinking especially of an essay that Toni Cade Bambara wrote called On Roles, right?
Yes. Come through, Mama Toni, in this conversation. That Aries fire just popped through from the ancestor realm.
Speaking to us. That's such an inspirational essay for me. And I often quote that essay when I speak, either publicly or when I'm speaking on social media, because I consider that a microphone too. And she reminds us that lots of people are happy to go out and kind of like run without understanding and remembering that there is work to be done where we are right here. And she ends the essay by saying the revolution isn't out there yet, but it's right here in the home. Exactly. It's right here where you are. The revolution is. So what are you doing in that space that you are occupying right now? Because the revolution is everywhere.
I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. So my favorite things that you always say, and I feel like we should say it together before I ask this question. You want to say it together on 3? You ready?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Fuck patriarchy.
I knew it. I love it.
Absolutely. But I'm getting so excited. I can't help it. So yes, I love when you say fuck the patriarchy. Like I say it with you every single time.
I appreciate that.
It's like call and response. Mona's getting ready to say, and remember, fuck the patriarchy. And I'm like, that's right, Mona. Say it. So it is call and response. It is so African. It's so diasporic. But I've been thinking a lot around the impact of patriarchy and misogyny on the bodies and the health of women and trans women and non-binary folk as we age. Like, what is the cost? One of the things I thought about, Mona, when I wanted to start this podcast is the journey we have as women, people who identify as women or identify as femmes, or people who are non-binary who identify with divine feminine energy. We are always pushed to the margins. And as you age, it feels like that gets amplified. And so I was wondering your opinion about the impact of patriarchy and misogyny on us as we age.
Yeah.
And what that looks like, your feelings on that.
Right. Well, my journey with femininity has been an interesting and complex one. So I haven't had hair this short since I was 13. So my family left Egypt when I was 7. And our first trip back to Egypt was 5 years later when I was 13. And I had a buzz cut. And I was walking through the street with an aunt of mine. And this guy walking behind us told a friend of his, pointing at me, that girl used to be a boy and they gave her a sex change. Those were his words direct. I mean, it was just like, sugarcoating, the misogyny, the transphobia, all the phobias you can imagine, and the patriarchy in that. And for a really long time, I was happy to push aside my femininity. I did not want it. I associated it with a powerlessness, and I associated it with violence, because very soon after that, I was sexually assaulted while my family was performing Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage. And ironically enough, I was totally covered. I was wearing hijab. It was the first time in my life. And, it's a reminder yet again, it has nothing to do with how you dress. It has everything to do with the person sexually assaulting you.
That's right.
And so I used my kind of visibly non-feminine presentation as a shield. And then when I felt, because I didn't have what I considered power enough to fight what femininity meant. And then when I was sexually assaulted during the pilgrimage, soon after, I began to wear hijab all the time because I felt I needed another barrier between me and patriarchy, and that still wasn't enough. They were still sexually assaulting me, even though I was covered from head to toe. Only my face and hands were showing. So I was like, fuck this shit. Nothing works. Obviously nothing works. It doesn't matter what you dress, but when you're young, so you try anything you can. And so what happened effectively is, from all of that time up until I was 25, when I took off my hijab, I had cut off what patriarchy had expected of me, which was this very, very specific presentation of femininity that patriarchy demanded of cis women. And I was like, no, you're not getting it, because I didn't have the power to fight patriarchy. And then I began to embrace my femininity slowly but surely. And I think I began to embrace it the more my own sense of power grew. Kind of like the more powerful I felt, the longer my hair got. And then I was sexually assaulted and beaten by the Egyptian police during that year of revolution when I was in my mid-40s. And I was like, okay, now what? And the now what with my femininity then was I had to set it on fire, because the Mona that I was when that happened to me died. She died. This is part of the shedding too. When I took off my hijab, that was a shedding. That was me now shedding the part of me that was scared of femininity. I'm ready now. And then they sexually assaulted me and beat me and broke both my arms in 2011. I was like, okay, you know what? That is over now. And I let that Mona die. She died so that this Mona could, the Mona that I became. And that Mona dyed her hair bright red to say, fuck you, I survived, you did not kill me. And my femininity is not only growing in power, it is on fire. And I got tattoos to like claim ownership of my body. And my first tattoo was the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, who is the goddess of retribution and sex. Because I was like, I want both retribution and sex, fuckers. I am claiming them both. And she's associated with the color red. And she found me. She's often presented in a very feminine way because she has the head of a lioness and the body of a woman. An artist friend of mine drew her for me, all like tits and hips and all like, you know, very, very feminine, yeah? And she found me in a museum in Italy where my people's stolen goods are, but in this hall where there are 16 statues of this goddess. And I was like, what's my first tattoo? What's my first tattoo? And I was standing under one of these 16 statues, and the director of the museum said, in this hall are 16 statues of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, who's the goddess of retribution and sex. And she found me. She found me at this moment when I needed her. And now everywhere I go and look for the statues of Sekhmet, stolen and displayed in museums around the world. And two things happen, Omi, two things. I look into her eyes and I promise her that one day she will go home. And she says to me, she says, stand in your power, Mona, stand in your power. And I've been standing in my power since I first got her tattoo and dyed my hair red. And this is where the power brought me. This is where the power of femininity brought me. So now I am ready to shed these things that I'm told femininity are and stand in the way that I stood when I was 13. But I now have the power I didn't have when I was 13. So I'm like, I'm back, fuckers. I'm back. I don't care what I look, but I'm here to fucking destroy you, patriarchy. So I'm here. I've absorbed the power of femininity. It's still in me, but I am now like this, and I am fighting at the nth degree.
Yes, listen, we are invited to die and be reborn so many times in a lifetime, right?
Yes.
And we will have so many guides along the way that will invite you to step into that flame and be reborn, to step into that space and be reborn. And I really love, it took you back to when you were 13, that space that we are in when our minds are so open and we are starting to figure out how we claim identity. Because I think about that a lot. The year I was 12 was the year my cycle started. And that was also the year where I had a hyperfixation around, will I be accepted, as I moved from one stage of life of a primary school, elementary school, to going to junior high school and living in a place where the aesthetic was so important for acceptance. Your aesthetic as a girl was so important for your acceptance. And I feel like this journey that I have been on through menopause has been reclaiming that 12-year-old girl and going back, letting her know how powerful she was.
Yes.
Right? Yes. So that 13-year-old Mona, that 12-year-old Omi, they're still present inside of us. They still walk with us. They still are watching us. They're still listening to us. They still are emerging,
Mm-hmm.
being reborn,
Mm-hmm.
being reborn, and being reborn in a way that is full of all of the experiences and the love and the healing and the transformation of the trauma.
Yes.
Because that transformative part of the trauma that you walk with, that gives you the wings, that phoenix, it's like when you burn all the way down to a cinder. And then when you're reborn, all of that information is still present in you, but you are a new thing. You are
Totally.
a whole new damn thing. And so I absolutely appreciate and understand that. And what a gift it is to remember that 13-year-old, to look at yourself now. You'll be 53 in August or July.
Yeah, well, I was born on July 28th, but registered on August 1st. So those are my 5 days of birth.
We're gonna do that. The 5 days of Mona. It sounds like a high goddess holiday, doesn't it? 5 days of Mona. We're gonna claim that this year. So the 5 days of Mona, right? That 13-year-old Mona will be present with you.
Yeah.
She's here with us now in this conversation. She was with you when you looked in that mirror the day you decided to cut your signature red hair. She was like, do it.
Yeah.
Do it, Mona.
Well, because I found her pictures, Omi. I went and found her pictures because one of the things, when I was looking in the mirror and preparing myself for this, because it took a few weeks where I was talking myself into it, because my red hair really it was for 8 years. I still say is, huh? My red hair for 8 years really was me. People associated it with me. I'm honored and privileged that so many artists and activists have gifted me with art of me that is basically my red hair,
Mm-hmm.
So for the longest time, people would look for the red hair, friends or people who are supposed to meet me. So prepared myself, would look in the mirror and say, okay, are you ready? Because something that represented you for such a long time, you're letting it go.
Mm-hmm.
But also, and I have to be really honest here too, alongside that conversation from that guy in Cairo who said that girl was a boy and they gave her a sex change, was another conversation that I had that I remembered when I looked in the mirror. And that was one of my own aunts, Omi. Because we went back to Egypt that year because my mother's mother died very suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody had told my mother that her mother was sick. So when they called and told her, our mother has died, my mother had a breakdown. She was not prepared. Mm-hmm. And my parents couldn't afford to fly us back to Egypt before that because they were students. So she hadn't seen her mother for 5 years. It was such a deep wound for her. Mm-hmm. So we went back to Egypt so she could be with her brothers and sisters. And that's why I was there when I was 13. And when we arrived at the airport, we arrive and they haven't seen us now since I was 7. And I arrived with this buzz cut. And one of my aunts told me several years later that she told her siblings, my mother's siblings, she didn't tell my mother or me, that she told her siblings that Mona is so ugly that her mother is going to have to pay dowry for her to get married. And I was like, on what fucking planet do you tell someone that? And on what fucking planet do you say that about your own niece? Again, because of the expectations of femininity. She expected a girl to look a certain way, and I didn't look that way. And in Egypt to this day, Omi, and I know this exists in many cultures, when I was preparing to cut my hair and I was talking about it on social media, so many Egyptian women wrote to me, and women of other cultures like South Asian cultures and others, who told me, East Asian, who told me that in Egypt, if you go to the hair salon and you want to cut your hair, they will often ask you, are you married? Is your husband okay with this? Are you sure you want to do this? Now, I know women in the US have told me that the hair salon would refuse and they have to keep going back. So this is my aunt in the year 1980 with her expectations of what a girl and femininity should look like. And she told me this. So buried deep inside with that 13-year-old girl is ugliness. And I wanted to confront this word ugly. What does it mean to be ugly? So I looked in the mirror and I said, Mona, be prepared for ugly, because it is time to confront ugly and liberate that 13-year-old girl from this yoke of ugly. So I found her picture and I looked at her, Omi, and I'm getting goosebumps. I'm going to make myself cry now.
I'm crying.
I looked into the eyes of this 13-year-old girl posing with her grandma and grandfather at the zoo with her brother. And I'm looking at this 13-year-old girl and I'm like, babe, darling, you are beautiful. Who said you're ugly? You're such a sweet, fantastic, strong girl. And you were burdened with ugly. Why? Why did they burden you with ugly? So I'm like, I am here to fucking destroy this ugly. I'm going to look it in the eye for you, and I'm going to break it, and I'm going to liberate you from this ugly. I'm going to start crying now.
I'm sorry. I know you're like, Omi has come undone. It is this, the ugly, to undo the ugly, because our girls are taught about ugliness so soon.
Yeah.
And they are taught that their value, their only value is in the aesthetic, in their attractiveness. Mm-hmm. And your aunt saying that to your family members, hearing this boy say that about you, or this man say this about you, and how that still sits so deeply inside your body 40 years later.
Yeah.
40 years later, the healing that is still available to you. Mm-hmm. 40 years later, the reclamation is so powerful. I'm so moved because at 12 was when I first realized that my attractiveness, or lack thereof, was currency. Mm. My feelings of attractiveness was currency. It was going to afford me something that I didn't even know what it was, but I was figuring it out. It was almost like a Hogwarts hat, you know, the sorting hat they have in Hogwarts. And it was like, I'll put this on your head as a girl. Mm-hmm. And if you're found wanting, you're going to end up in that house where all the unattractive, ugly people are. And you are not valuable. You are not lovable. You're not worthy of being seen or supported or any of those things. But if you put this hat on, that's the house where the attractive people live. And those people are popular and lovable and desirable and worthy of respect. And that's where you want to go. And it happens to us so soon. That gets implanted. No matter what work you do in this world, there's unlearning around that.
Yeah.
And that just really struck a nerve. It really struck a nerve. And I appreciate that. I'm going to take a breath. That really profoundly sat with me. Yeah. I'm wondering for you in this moment, you know, because you have talked about the perimenopause and you've expressed yourself very, very boldly about how you're experiencing menopause, how you're experiencing perimenopause. What does this mean? The questions, the what the fuck moments where you're like, what the fuck is this? What the fuck is this? It feels like it's almost like a constant like waking up and sitting on the side of the bed like, what the fuck? So it's a very interesting time. And also wondering how you're experiencing intimacy and vulnerability and pleasure.
Yes.
In this moment. As you reclaiming yourself, how are you experiencing that?
Yes. Well, I think one of the hardest things, and it took me a while to get to actually say this, was how my sex drive and libido had basically just completely stopped, halted, been put on a pause, whatever it is. I mean, I was talking to Heather the other day and I was like, Heather, my sex drive was broken. And she was saying, it's just on pause. Don't worry. It's not broken, because
it's not
people
broken.
on the other side say it will be. And I was able to say that to her and lightheartedly, because I feel that I am coming out on the other side now, finally, like I'm dovetailing. But honestly, Omi, this was the hardest aspect of it. I fought for such a long time to claim my sexuality. Again, because of my own cultural and faith backgrounds. And I speak very honestly about it in my first book and in my second book, about how because of the way I was raised and because of my faith background and cultural expectations, I waited until I was 28, 29, until I became sexually active. And I feel so sad now for my younger self that I denied her all of this time. She could have been experiencing her body and sexual pleasure with another person, because I've been masturbating since I was 11. But to experience sex with another person, I denied her that pleasure. So I feel that I came to it somewhat late. And then I feel it began to change in my late 40s, but it was really around 50, 51, where I barely thought about sex. And I was like, oh my God, something that I fought so hard, first of all, to claim, and then to get rid of the guilt. I basically say I fucked the guilt out of my system, because it took me And then I finally stood at a place where I had fucked it out of my system. I knew what pleased me. I knew what worked. I knew what I wanted. I knew that I was increasingly identifying as a queer person. And then all of a sudden I'm just like, oh my God, where's sex? Where's it gone? And that was the unspoken for me for a really long time. And I realized why this now was the challenge, because I was in Australia last year doing some speaking engagements, and I had dinner with a very good friend of mine. And she leans over at dinner. It was just the two of us, but still, she was like, Mona, oh my God, my sex. Oh my God, what the fuck? She goes, my boyfriend now is like, what happened to you? You were always the one initiating it. And she was also of Arab descent. I couldn't even say in response to her. I have to write back now and say to her, I know exactly what you mean. I just listened because I wasn't ready to say the words. I was like, oh my God, how is this happening? Now I feel I'm ready to say the words because I feel like I'm coming out of it. But the fact that it so shook me, Omi, it was like that. So I am child-free by choice. I have never wanted to be wanted children, and I'm very happy that I made this choice. So that wasn't the thing that upset me or saddened me or that I felt I had to let go of the most, my fertility or my fertile years. No, I was sad that my menstrual cycle was going to end because it's the most kind of consistent thing. The thing that shook me the most was my sex drive. Where the fuck has my sex drive gone? So now it's beginning again. I was like, oh my goodness, yes, walking there. So that's what it's done. It's made me kind of like just stop, pause, and think about how important my body is to me, how important pleasure is to me, how important desire is to me, and to kind of reassess what all of those things mean. After I had a particular fight that I thought I had resolved, which was to claim and own sex and sexuality, and then that pause. And now I feel like I'm in another stage now of claiming that fight or claiming desire and pleasure.
I'm glad that you're claiming desire and pleasure. I am struggling with desire and pleasure. I think that, I don't know if my sex drive has tanked, but more so I have a hesitancy around intimacy, dating, spending intimate time with people, because I feel like some of the ways in which I dated in the past, I've been married before, I'm divorced. I feel like I didn't do it healthy. I didn't do it in a way that really honored who I wanted to be. And so now I'm walking with some fear around that vulnerability, that intimacy, connecting with someone else and not wanting to do it in unhealthy ways, not wanting to replicate some kind of toxicity that would really, I don't know, would take me out this time if I did it this time around. I'm like, I'm too old to like make that mistake. And so it makes me hesitate. And so I've been having these conversations with good girlfriends around like, I really do want to date and I do want to experience pleasure outside of my own hands, touching my own body. Is that still available to me? And to have that be affirmed as hell yes, it's available to you. My friend Courtney, I think will be 61 or 62 in October, and told me that her and her husband are having the best sex that they've ever had. Yes to the 60s and having good ass sex. So,
well, I mean, so currently I have a partner. So I was very, very briefly married. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I never wanted to be married and got out of it quickly. But I've had several partners in my life. And currently I have a partner. We've been together for 5 years. And he's bisexual. I identify as queer. And it took me a while to get to a place where I can tell a partner, this is my primary partner, I'm polyamorous. I can't do monogamy. I thought I could in the past, but I realized that I wasn't being honest with myself. And I'm very, very happy, if I can even use that, because it's his identity, that he's a cis bisexual man, because I'm done with cishet men, Omi. Cishet men need so much work. They need so much. They need to deprogram themselves. And unless I see proof, I need the certificate, like a certificate published saying that you've done the work.
You need receipts.
It's like there's so much work involved, and I hear you. So much of that in my past. So my partner is bisexual, and I'm really, really glad that this has been happening with him, because I've been talking to him about it, and he's very supportive and very understanding. We had sex this morning, if I can tell you that.
So, yay! Yes, we talk about good sex in the middle of a pandemic. Yes, we can.
So this is all by way of just like telling you that this has been a process that I've been going through, and I'm really glad I'm going through it with him, because he has done the work and he knows what patriarchy does, because he has to confront patriarchy because of his own non-heteronormativity. He's had to confront it when it comes to heteronormativity and masculinity, because you have to understand as a bisexual man what heteronormativity expects of you, what masculinity according to the dictates of the patriarchy expects of you. And I wouldn't want to be with anyone who hasn't done that work right now. I don't have the fucking patience, you know?
We are all impacted by patriarchy in such deep ways. The same way that we talk about internalized oppression around race. There's been so much deep work around that allows people to access, well, what is the healing that is necessary for us to disrupt, dismantle, and do away with white supremacy and racism? We talk about that. But the patriarchy, I feel like you do. I feel like there are people out there who are doing that, but I also feel like we are less willing to have that interrogation of our own internalized patriarchy. I know that parts of my own internalized patriarchy has been a barrier to me accessing pleasure, has been a barrier to me finding myself to be valuable outside of the aesthetic. Like what does my being here in the world is enough? What does it mean to know that you are enough? And then how does that translate? And, I've been rereading Adrienne Maree Brown's Pleasure Activism.
Yes, she's fantastic. I love her.
And all of the ways that Adrienne invites us to think about pleasure that absolutely is associated with sex and sexuality and sexual expression, but also pleasure that is associated with the things that you do in this world that is liberatory, movement, performance, art, social justice work, spiritual practice, healing, the putting on lipstick, dancing, eating good food. There's so many ways we can access pleasure.
Yes.
And I think that as we age, our pleasure spectrum can get bigger.
Yes.
It can get bigger. So you and I are we're the same age. And so I'm glad to know that there are folk who are further on down the journey or further on down the road than we are, who can look back at us and say, listen, it's paused, it's not broken.
Yes.
There's so much more available to you.
Yes.
And that intimacy and vulnerability outside of partnerships is also available to you in ways that's powerful. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. They're saying, come this way. There's more and more power the closer you get to this. Come this way. I love that.
They're leaving the light on for us, which I'm grateful for. What do you think is the conversation that we should have that's more intergenerational? If we were going to invite some younger folk to this conversation with us, folk who are in their 30s, what do you think you would want to offer to that conversation, to those women coming behind us who find themselves in these places? It'll be a unique experience because everybody's experience is different. But what would you want that conversation to look like if it's more intergenerational?
Right. I would want them, and I often have those conversations because a lot of the places where I go have an audience that is across the age ranges, and I'm very happy to have friends who are also much younger than me as well as older. And I really appreciate that. And on social media as well, because I consider what I do on social media activism and a form of mothering and teaching, as well as a conversation. So I would want them to know, what I tell them when I'm there in real life with them in these various spaces. And that is, you have a power and you can own that power. And patriarchy does its damnedest to try to convince you that you have no power or that your power is what I call crumbs that you have to accept in return. Just accept and be happy with them. And that you have to understand that if you're not going to accept these crumbs so that you can gain proximity to patriarchy, it's not enough, because it's not going to protect you against patriarchy. And the entity, the power that gives you those crumbs can very easily take it away. So reject the crumbs and make your own cake. That's the heart of anarchism for me, because the older I get, the more I am an anarchist, the more I identify as an anarchist. Now, this fascist fuck Trump, when he talks about this is anarchistic violence and it's Antifa, that's bullshit. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about anarchism as a movement, as a social movement, and as a philosophy. That basically we're seeing why it's necessary when we look around at the ways the state has failed, whether it's during the pandemic all these decades and decades of white supremacy and capitalism and police brutality and police violence, the failure and the horrendous abuse of power and the injustice of the military, of all forms of authority, of capitalism, of patriarchy, all of these are what my anarchism represents the opposite of. I'm using so I'm an anarchist feminist, because within that you need feminism, because every movement lacks that gender perspective, because it's usually a group of cis men fighting another group of cis men. And if you see this uprising now, I'm glad that so many people are demanding justice for George Floyd. What about Breonna Taylor? What about all the black women? This is why Say Her Name came about. Yesterday, a trans woman was viciously attacked in Minneapolis by cis black women and black men. Why? Why in the middle of a revolution are we attacking each other? During these revolutionary times is when we have to dismantle all of these oppressions. And that's why I'm an anarchist feminist, because I don't believe in hierarchy and I don't believe in authority, and I want to dismantle all of those oppressions. So that's my conversation to young people, is like to see what you're opposing and to make sure that it's intersectional, as Professor Kimberly Crenshaw says, to make sure that you're anarchist in your intention, even if you don't identify as an anarchist, so that you don't focus on one set of oppression and then forget the other sets of oppression. And then finally, I tell them that patriarchy as an octopus. The head of it is patriarchy, but the tentacles are what we call the systems of oppression that keep patriarchy alive. So I believe it's not enough to fight white supremacy. It's not enough to fight capitalism. It's not enough to fight ageism or ableism or homophobia or transphobia. All of those are oppressions used by patriarchy. So we have to go for the head and fight all of those oppressions at once. And that's what makes me excited about this moment, but only if this moment is going to fight all of these oppressions and not just uplift cis men and leave the rest of us behind.
It has to be all of us. I know that my liberation as a cis hetero Black woman born and raised in the American South is not going to be fully realized if my trans sisters are not free. I know that. I know it's an impossibility for Black people to be fully free if Indigenous people are not fully free. Like there's so many ways of the interconnectedness of our oppression. It's also about the interconnectedness of our liberation. And if I don't look at that, if I don't see my liberation connected to your liberation and connected to other people's liberation, then what am I doing? I'm only reinforcing the system. And so I appreciate that. So the last two questions. One is, I want you to time travel to the future. Maybe 20 years from now, maybe 20 years from now when we're 73, we're on the brink of 73. I wonder what your hopes are for yourself, not for the world, because you are doing that work, and I know you will always do that work. Unless something really dramatic happens to you, like I can't imagine you divorcing yourself from this commitment to this work you've always done. But I want to ask you specifically for you, where would you want to be? That 73-year-old Mona, what is your hope for her? What do you desire for her? What do you want to manifest or conjure for her?
The first word that comes to mind, Omi, is restlessness. I want 73-year-old Mona to be restless, because it's through that restlessness that I work to be free. I believe that my freedom and the work that I do towards it comes from this restlessness. So I want 73-year-old Mona to be restless.
All right. We're going to call forth this restlessness that keeps her striving for this. And I want that for her, if that's what you want for her. That's the most important thing. And then the other piece, we have done this thing where we've asked people who I've interviewed to make an offering. So I am going to conjure a tangible guide that will be available in a book form for folks to have access to. I want it to be interactive. We're trying to figure out what it can look like, and that it will be this thing that you would be able to pass off to somebody and say, I've purchased this guide for Black girls who are going through menopause, and I would like to gift it to you. And in that will be offerings that have been made across the board, from people who haven't been interviewed, but most certainly from people who've been interviewed. What kind of offering would you make to a guide around menopause?
The first thing that came to mind is I want to put an illustration of this tattoo of the goddess Sekhmet that is on my arm, because Sekhmet was a warrior and a healer. And I feel that those two aspects of her that she's most known for are so important right now because of the pandemic, because of the revolution. But they're also really important for my perimenopausal journey, because I feel that it involves both of these things. I'm fighting against patriarchal expectations for women our age, because I can say our for the two of us, the patriarchal expectations. I am a warrior against the patriarchy, and I'm also healing from all of those things. Like I said, what 13-year-old Mona used to hear, because now I'm looking at her 40 years later. And I feel that this period I feel like I'm in a transition, because like I said, this is how I've connected to the pandemic. Along this corridor, this transitional corridor that I am walking to get through my perimenopause, to get to menopause, I feel that healing aspect of Sekhmet is so important. So I would offer Sekhmet in a red dress, because red is such an important color, was with my hair, and it represents her. She's known as the lady in red. I would offer her so that people who need a guide or solidarity or power would get that warrior healer and say, yes, I want to be the warrior healer for myself.
Mm-hmm. There's so much alignment. People who will hear this interview will not know that both Mona and I have on red. So we both so we both arrived to the interview with red on.
Yes.
And ironically, I'm a part of a community here in North Carolina where there's a group of women of color who are called warrior healers. And they talk about this all the time. They talk about the power of the warrior, the identity of the warrior, the role of the warrior, and also the role of the healer, right?
Yes.
And how that is in concert with each other. And the fact that you're offering a Sekhmet, that you're offering the goddess to us,
yes.
right? Because so many goddesses are available to us, but this specific goddess, this warrior goddess, this goddess that has so much power and passion, that her color is red, is such a beautiful offering to this guide. And because I feel like she's your patron saint. And so I guess she's here with us right now in this conversation. She said, yes, I wanted to be present for this conversation. So we give honor and praise to the goddess Sekhmet and thank her for being with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank
you
for being with me today. And I'm appreciative again for your emphatic yes, and for this moment that we find ourselves in together, and for the transformation and rebirthing that we're bearing witness to.
I'm so honored to be on the Black Girl's Guide to Menopause, Omi, and I'm especially honored because this space belongs to Black women and girls, and I'm honored that as a woman of color, you invited me into it. And I hope that what I brought to the space is an example and an offering of love and solidarity that I love to give, every day when I wake up first thing on social media, and that is like my revolutionary rallying cry, love and solidarity. So please accept my love and solidarity for you and all your listeners.
I accept that, and I'm sending it back. Thank you. Hey folks, this is Omi. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. Quick reminders to please check out the notes to the episode, because I provide a link for you on where you can find books by Mona Eltahawy. She has 2 books that are out. The first one being Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, and her latest book, 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. I promise you will enjoy both of these books. Also, if you haven't had a chance to check out our new website, please do. It is blackgirlsguide-to-survivingmenopause.com. And on our website, there are ways for you to stay in touch with us and let us know what your thoughts are on the podcast. And there are also ways for you to support. Please consider becoming a Patreon. The link to our Patreon account is on the website. And if you are unable to be a consistent monthly sustainer, please consider making a one-time donation. And the information for the Cash App, Venmo, and PayPal also are in the episode notes. Once again, I want to remind folk about listener letters. We really want to hear from you. What are the questions that you want to ask? What are the episodes that you would like for us to produce for you? The content you would like to hear? You can send your listener letters to decolonizingthecrone@gmail.com and put listener letters in the subject line. I promise you, any questions that you ask, any suggestions that you make, we will take seriously as an offering from your altar to ours. So once again, thanks again for listening to the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause, and we'll see you on the dark side of the moon.